Formula One is in Sao Paulo, Brazil at the Autodromos Carlos Pace circuit, which yields many changes in gradient, a high downforce setup, and has many opportunities for overtaking, such as in the curvy sections of turn 1 and 4, as well as in the back straight where the DRS zone comes into play. This weekend, Aston Martin finds pace, the sprint race has loads of action, the Ferrari curse continues, and much more. Tune in as I discuss all things Sao Paulo 2023. Hey guys, hope you guys are having a great week thus far. I'm going to be honest, this weekend was quite exciting, quite action-packed. Another weekend in which we have a sprint race, which I feel like has been getting a decent amount of hate, but I thought it was pretty decent this weekend. Nonetheless, let's talk about qualifying and the sprint shootout real quick. In this, both AlphaTauris got out in Q1. The Alpines and Haas got out in Q2. It was very dark in Q3. It seemed like rain was coming, so some people opted to go out a little bit later. The people that went out right away actually got the benefit of this situation. In this, when the rain started to come, Piastri caused a brief yellow as he went off track. The teams that waited did end up getting the short end of the stick, as I mentioned. The rest of qualifying ended up getting canceled simply because of the rain. Max was on pole, Leclerc and Stroll were 2 and 3 respectively. So Stroll getting up there, Aston Martin seeming like they were showing some pace in that qualifying session. The sprint shootout was a different story as Ocon got into the barrier, got into Alonso. Unfortunately for Aston Martin, Alonso ended up with a puncture, and that was quite a strange wreck there as Ocon just kind of lost it and got into Alonso. The AlphaTauris did much better in the sprint shootout than as opposed to the qualifying session, and Norris ended up getting the sprint shootout pole. And so that brings us into the sprint race. So let's talk about that. And holy smokes, the sprint race was extremely exciting. In this, we get a pretty condensed, action-packed race, and I feel like the Sao Paulo gives many opportunities for overtaking, especially in that first section. It's very slow and curvy, and it gives opportunities for some of these drivers in the middle of the pack to really make some moves. And we kind of saw that in this sprint race, a lot of overtaking, and then people ending up getting a good run right off of that section in turn 4 and being able to take back their position, which is kind of cool, seeing people shuffle back and forth. In this, we see Hamilton get Perez quite early on in the race. We see Piastri get off track as well. A lot of craziness going on at the start. Max gets Lando. Remember, Lando did have the sprint race pole. And then Russell takes second place from Norris. And it seemed right off the bat, you're like, okay, Mercedes is making some moves in the start, right? And Mercedes looks good. And then Perez ends up getting Hamilton. In this weekend, we see a pretty good trend in which Perez is able to stick with Verstappen pretty consistently throughout the weekend, and so props to him on keeping up with his teammate there. But Leclerc pushes at Hamilton and Perez as they're kind of going back and forth, and this is going to be a trend as we see Hamilton and Perez kind of dueling it and duking it out here in the sprint race. Norris ends up getting back on Russell, and Perez gets Russell, but then Russell gets him right back. And so it's just kind of Mercedes versus Perez here in this part of the race, in the sprint race. And then Ricciardo gets a very good run and ends up getting Sainz. We see the Ferraris and AlphaTauris getting pretty racy in this sprint race, and Sainz ends up getting him right back. As I mentioned, they're getting good runs off of this curvy section. Turn 4 was a great passing opportunity. And then right after that, they were able to get good runs and get their position back that they lost, oftentimes, not every time. But Ricciardo gets Sainz again. So again, Ricciardo passes Sainz twice, and then Sainz gets him right back. And then Piastri is trying to make a run off of this situation, try to benefit from it, and then gets Ricciardo as well. And this trend will continue as Alonso gets Gasly, and then Gasly gets Alonso right back. Leclerc gets Hamilton. Tsunoda and Ricciardo both gain positions, and then Verstappen ends up kind of pulling away with the win here in the sprint race. And so a lot of times people are saying that the sprint races are quite boring and say that they just project what's going to happen the next day anyway. However, I found this to be quite an exciting sprint race where we saw a lot of these middle upper pack teams. We saw Aston Martins competing with Ferraris and Mercedes, and a lot of shuffling going around here, and I found that quite exciting. And so that was quite fun, though nobody really could smell Verstappen either way, some of the storylines that I saw is that it looked like Perez was able to keep up with Verstappen, and so hopefully that carries over to race day. Hopefully he does not wreck in the first lap. McLaren looks quite good, so hopefully they can maybe put some pressure on Max, or at least be competing with somebody for the podium positions tomorrow. Mercedes looks awfully draggy. Throughout this, they were getting past and trying to regain their positions. Like the other teams that I mentioned, they may have gotten overtaken, but able to regain their position and maybe getting overtaken eventually. But Mercedes seemed as that when they got overtaken, they never really had a contention to get their spot back, which is kind of a concern for them. And that'll kind of forecast what the race looks like here. AlphaTauri, my hope for them, they seemed quite quick in the sprint race, so hopefully they can translate that over to the actual race on Sunday. And then really can Aston Martin find their race pace? Unfortunately, their qualifying sessions didn't go maybe to their liking, with Alonso getting taken out in that sprint shootout, but hopefully they can have a good showing on Sunday. And so let's go ahead and get into the race and talk about how that shaped away. And so if you thought the sprint race was exciting, if you like the comers and goers, they kind of gave us all that, but in like the first lap. It was a pretty crazy first lap, and that first turn one is a very good overtaking opportunity, and many drivers got very aggressive in this first section. And so really we see in this first section, Leclerc gets off the road in the formation lap before the race even starts. Leclerc gets into the wall, kind of loses it, and he mentions that he lost the hydraulics. Really, he's dealing with cold tires, trying to get them up to speed, and ends up losing it. And so that was very unfortunate for Ferrari, as they were forecasted to maybe get both their cars and shooting for top 5 positions today. Nonetheless, Magnussen is going to come across, and these people are Haas is in the middle of the back of the pack here. And so Magnussen comes across, squeezes Hülkenberg. In doing so, Albon and Hülkenberg touch, and then Albon slides up and bangs into Magnussen and takes out both cars. And so in this, debris goes flying, tires go flying, and not only do Magnussen and Albon get injured, their cars get hurt because of this, but also we see debris hitting Ricciardo, and that is in the form of a tire, and so that injures his rear wing. And as I mentioned, AlphaTauri is hoping to get points today, and so let's see how that impacts the rest of his race. But in this, there's a lot of damage, and this is going to take a lot of time to clean up, and so they go ahead and red flag the race. And so we are due for a restart. And so on the restart, Max gets an insanely good jump, and I feel like he did this on the prior restart as well, in which there's no real spot for anybody to really give him a run for his money here. And so he takes off right away, and if I'm him, I'm trying to do the same thing, trying to avoid any damage or anything like that. But Alonso gets Hamilton on the start, and it looks like Aston Martin's going to be quite racy in this in Sao Paulo. And then we see Norris putting some pressure on Max eventually, and it doesn't really come to anything though. He's kind of sniffing his back end, but Max ends up being able to pull away and doesn't really get contended for much of the race. Also, we see Perez get Russell, and then Perez gets Hamilton. As I mentioned just prior, Mercedes is really struggling with a very draggy car, and in this they struggle to, they're defending, but really they get overtaken and they really can't get that spot back. And so Perez puts the moves on them quite early, and then lap 25, Stroll gets Russell with ease. As I mentioned, Mercedes is struggling. They're getting passed by Lance Stroll and the Aston Martins, which is if I'm them, I'm going to be concerned with that. And then Stroll ends up getting Hamilton as well, so he double dips on the Mercedes clan. And then Gasly ends up getting Bottas. We see Gasly start to make his climb from this, and really the general storyline we see here is Mercedes falls. A lot of these people are gaining positions as Mercedes starts to work its way down here. So Gasly gets Bottas. Sainz ends up getting both of the Mercedes by lap 37. And if I'm with Ferrari, I'm like, man, if only Leclerc didn't botch the formation lap, we'd probably have both cars passing Mercedes in this. And we're in this highly contended Constructors Championship here. and Ferrari's thrown right into the mix there. And so this is kind of concerning for them in that race because they get no points with Leclerc being out. Nonetheless, and ends up retiring his car. They've forecast based on their data, they're seeing that there is imminent failure of the car. And so they're like, we're already probably going to be out of the points anyway, so why are we going to risk this? Because they just continue to fall, and it's just very draggy. Nonetheless, that kind of brings us to this back part of the race where we see one of the better duels that we've had all year, and that is between Perez and Alonso. Alonso's coming off this insane struggle in the middle to end of this season, and it's been awesome to see him in the front this weekend. In this, we see him and Perez has been struggling as well. So we have both these drivers who have been struggling, who get the opportunity to race one another for a podium spot, and it's all coming together here on this last 2 laps of the race. We have 1 lap to go. Perez passes Alonso, and then Alonso gets on the DRS and tries to pass Perez back to no avail. Perez is able to stick with this and defends the position quite well. Then Alonso gets a good run on turn 4, executes the pass. We're wondering, oh my goodness, is this going to stick? We're on the last lap here. Alonso gets that position, but they race all the way to the end on the back straight, and Perez starts to come around, and we see Perez overshoot Alonso, and we're like, oh my gosh, did Alonso get 3rd place, or did he get past the last second by Perez? They slow it down, and it ends up being a photo finish. Oh my goodness, so close here. Alonso ends up getting on the podium. I feel like if Perez maybe had 1 more lap, he would have been able to squeeze out that position and get on podium. But nonetheless, let's talk about the results of the race, and then we'll get into my overall thoughts of the race. So let's get into the results of the race. And so we have Max Verstappen winning his 17th race of the season. It's absolutely insane, the run he's on this year. Lando Norris getting very respectable 2nd place. It didn't seem like he had to do much work today, as he did last race, having to climb all the way back from the back of the field. Nonetheless, he was able to keep that gap within 10 seconds of Max, but couldn't really sniffed him in the beginning of the race, but wasn't able to make anything of it. Fernando Alonso gets on pole. It really seems like Aston Martin's upgrades that they have been talking about for weeks have finally come to fruition here. And so props to him on that finish. It was an amazing drive by him today. Sergio Perez getting 4th place. Really respectable drive by him. He made several passes early on in the race and then fought Fernando quite well and sticking pretty relatively close to his teammate and not crashing out in the first lap. We cannot get too mad at him with this 4th place finish. Lance Stroll, again, Aston Martin figuring something out. Props to Lance. Qualified quite well and was able to stake a 5th place finish as well. Carlos Sainz getting quite racy today and ends up in 6th. I'd imagine Leclerc would have been right up there as well if he wouldn't have wrecked out. Pierre Gasly making the moves on the Mercedes today, and he ends up getting points for Alpine. You'd imagine that Ocon's also there as well, and so you'd imagine they'd be quite happy with double points this weekend. Lewis Hamilton in 8th. As I mentioned, the Mercedes were struggling today. He did not decide to pull it in like Russell did. Didn't have to do that, but still being able to get points when you have such a draggy car. He had an insanely good drive today, trying to keep that just in the front end of the pack here. Yuki Tsunoda had a really good weekend this weekend. In the sprint race, him and Ricciardo looked very good, and then he ends up getting points for AlphaTauri, but you'd imagine they would like double points in a race and in a weekend where they had this much pace, but we see Ricciardo down in 13th, dealing with that early damage from the Magnussen and Albon crash in the beginning of the race. Logan Sargent just missing out on points in 11th. Nico Hulkenberg in 12th did have that incident in the beginning of the race where he kind of initiated some of this drama in the beginning, but was able to stay out of damage there. Oscar Piastri just having a really rough day, ending up in 14th. You'd imagine he would have liked to be much better this weekend, and that would probably be one of the bigger losers of the people that finished this race. George Russell retiring the car, Bottas, Zhou Guanyu, Magnussen, Albon, and Leclerc retiring their cars throughout the race as well. Nonetheless, let's talk about my thoughts on the weekend. Generally, I thought that Sao Paulo really showed very well this weekend. It gave many passing opportunities. I did feel like the qualifying and sprint race portions of the weekend were more exciting than the actual race, besides the last lap of the race, and maybe the start, I guess, if you think crashes are exciting. But I thought it showed quite well. We saw Aston Martin really regaining the pace they had at the beginning of the year, and really what I feel like this season has been missing is really people contending Max, but if you go a step down from that, really people contending for the podium. And in weekends where we really don't know who's going to be on podium, it's nice to have that other team in the mix. When you take Aston Martin out of it, it's like, okay, it could be a Mercedes and a McLaren one weekend, or a Ferrari and a McLaren. And having that third or fourth player in that mix really makes for a better race weekend, in my opinion. Several blunders throughout the weekend where people really dropped the bag, notably Leclerc. Unfortunate situation for him. And I mentioned the Constructors' Championship. But nonetheless, I felt entertained with this weekend, and I hope you did as well. But overall, what did you guys think of the race and of the weekend? Let me know in the comment section down below. And if you enjoyed the video and you want to see more motorsports content, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to my channel. Otherwise, thank you so much for watching. Thank you for tuning in to my content. A few more weekends left of the Formula One season, but be on the lookout for tons more motorsports videos to come. Have a great week. Peace.